right, welcome to Crow 777 Radio Podcast. This is episode 8, and I have brought back James Alfred. We're going to talk about social engineering and the music industry and Hollywood and how all these things connect to governance, the government, the White House, the royal family. There is no separating the entertainment industry on any level from how this world is governed. This will be the last episode where the audio quality is what you're hearing now. I will be improving how I'm doing this. I've had to use free tools up to now, and I've had some people give me some tools that should improve the audio quality. This is the first hour. The second hour will be available to everybody on crow777radio.com. And I would warn everyone, an organized attack has been levied against me. crow777.com, just my name.com, has been taken over by people flying Baphomet, satanic, and Masonic colors. I'm not the only one they're doing this to, and we have tracked them. It is an organized attack coming out from outside the country. So my podcast that carries the second hour of this episode is https://crow777radio.com. In the second hour, we're going to cover the following things: the music industry PSYOP, military-industrial complex, the CIA, Woodstock, Laurel Canyon, the Monterey Pop Festival, Charles Manson murder hoax murders, the planned and executed hippie movement designed to control a generation, Frank Zappa, the Byrds, the Beatles, the constructed hippie movement, spellcraft, public manipulation, the mind weapon, the O.J. Simpson hoax murder trial, Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys, the reason for hoax events, how the world is governed with hoax news, Nixon, the Kent State shooting hoax, rock stars and hoaxes, the connection between Hollywood, the White House, and the music industry, Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, the Altamont murder hoax that the Rolling Stones put on after Woodstock, rock star relationship to the military-industrial complex and royalty and the bloodlines that are entertainment, Ronald Reagan, the first open actor-president, Jimmy Stewart, a general in the USAF, Jim Morrison's father of the Doors, who started the Vietnam War, all the rock stars that just happened to be at Altamont shootings, Joe Walsh, Chrissy Hine from the Pretenders, and members of the band Devo, how information is king and corporate data control. There's a lot more, occult magic, corporate malfeasance. It goes on and on. It's a hell of an episode. And again, this will be the last episode where the audio quality is just passable. From here on in, it'll get better. So let's jump in. Here we go. Cheers. All right. Welcome to Crow 777 Radio Podcast. This is episode number 8, and I have brought James Alfred back to help me kind of keep some system, in a systematic way, get our arms around what we're going to cover today. It's a pretty telling, distinct bunch of information that we're going to throw at you. And basically what it comes down to is we're going to demonstrate to you that the military-industrial complex, the CIA, and basically the same controlling systems that we see and talk about on this show a lot were the whole reason for the beginning of early rock and roll, the hippie movement, the rock music of the 60s, and even Woodstock, all just kind of a conglomeration of staged, pre-planned events. So with that, welcome aboard, James.
Thanks, Crow, for having me back. Looking forward to this.
No problem. Let's quickly clue people in so they remember who you are. You were on a little while ago, but go ahead and intro yourself and what you've been working on.
Sure. Just more or less kind of an armchair researcher. Initially got involved with some of this material when the idea of the lunar wave was attached to the enigma named Hattie Bow. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, a lot of questions and whether or not that's disinformation and so forth. But initially got involved with that. And then slowly but surely have just been kind of pursuing different paths of research in respect to the moon, into alchemy, occultism, all that interesting stuff. So, it kind of brings me back to a conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, so what I did is I asked James to vet some of the material that we're going to go over here, and I'm hoping that he can kind of drive this conversation in an orderly manner because he's got a very analytical mind where I'm much more abstract. And it's good to have someone like James around because I would wander off in every direction. But to be very clear to people, what we're going to talk about here and what we're going to demonstrate is just the complete precognition of the things that we think are just history that happened because it happened. This is not the case. These events were planned. The people who were involved were part and parcel of what I call fraud. The military-industrial complex clearly plays into this, and we'll draw lines from some of our favorite rock stars back into their parents and before that to demonstrate that they're all coming from military backgrounds, many of them in the Secret Service or intelligence areas. But before we get started here, people can read up on what we're going to talk about, but here's my problem. A lot of the people who have done research into the things that we're going to cover here, one of the things, a guy did a lot of research on Laurel Canyon. Do you remember the name of the book that he did?
Yeah, it was David McGowan, his excellent book, something about the mysterious Laurel Canyon. I'm butchering it, but the author's name is David McGowan, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar with his work.
Right. So, I mean, if you did a search for McGowan and Laurel Canyon, you would come across his work. And he's not the only one that's done this. But to jump back, my problem is this. While we vetted a lot of the information that we're going to use here, and part of it was sourced from, all over the place, McGowan was some of the source, these people don't get it quite right in my book, in that they are under the impression that the murders that are presented in history, like the Manson murders, they act like those are real savage murders, that the deaths that we talk about are real. And I maintain that while people do die and murders do occur, for the most part in these historical accounts, nobody is dying, nobody is getting hurt, and people are dying by the numbers. As an example, in the material that we're going to cover, a lot of people died on October 12th. Well, anyone who's done any occult research understands that that's Aleister Crowley's birthday. So the idea that 10 or 15 people happen to check out all in, show business and rock on this day is ludicrous. It's all coding to this kind of occult game that's being played. But before we jump in here, I want everyone to be completely clear that what we're talking about did not end in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. It is still going on now. And we see it in recent events like the death of David Bowie and the death of Prince. And we will use Prince as an example here. I recently sat down and forced myself to watch the 2016 Hall of Fame induction ceremony. And funny enough, the first induction of that show was Deep Purple. And this is on the tail of Prince. And Lars Ulrich of Metallica fame, and the guy who was involved in all that silliness with Napster, which was all staged events, he came out wearing a purple jacket and took it off to show everyone that it was in fact labeled Deep Purple. This was all echoing the death of Prince. And while I won't go into how the color purple has been echoed across all media, I will give a couple examples here. The Queen of England, who seems to be the head of a lot of what goes on, or people are reporting to her or the royal family in some way, recently had a new logo made, and it was purple all of a sudden right around the death of Prince. But really, what really tops it off is there was a beer released, a beer that you drink released on the day that Prince died, called Purple Rain. It had been in the planning for a while, and the word rain was not spelled like R-A-I-N. It's like the reign of a king. And it was released, so you can see what's going on here. But what really kind of stuck out in my mind as I watched the 2016 induction was in the middle of all these kind of Hollywood entertainment ceremonies, they always have in memoriam so that they can drive death home into the minds of all the people, so that we can all buy into the fact that we all need to die by the time we're about 74. But they listed Bowie, they listed a bunch of people, but they did not list Prince. At the end of the 2016 Hall of Fame induction, they closed with a Prince clip of him playing Guitar Gently Weeps at a previous induction, which I believe was for one of the Beatles, probably George Harrison or something, I don't remember. But this Prince echo and the color purple was just shot out across all media to do the spell casting that was all derived around the hoax death of Prince. And to take it a bit further, the day that Prince died, I think I was aware of it pretty early in the day, But within about 5 minutes of the news announcing that Prince had supposedly died, the global or the worldwide Google logo had already changed over to Purple Rain. So you can see the kind of spellcraft game that's going on. And even there are channels out there on YouTube that covered how the Obamas were wearing purple right in the vicinity of the death of Prince. Of course, Obama talked about him, and there's been a lot of insight about how the political game here is blue and red in the United States, but where those two colors meet is purple. But anyhow, let's jump back over. I just wanted to demonstrate to you that the kind of occult spellcraft that goes on around all these famous entertainers is as alive today as it ever was. So I'm going to throw it back over to you, James, and we can I'll let you lead us into this because there is just so much to cover.
Yeah, there's a lot. And we had kind of briefly talked about this when we were talking about the idea of there being a fake Paul McCartney. And in one of the articles I put together, there's a curious moment where David Crosby pops into a Beatles press conference in L.A., and I want to say that's like mid-1966, where there's a lot of odd things happening with the Beatles and so forth. So that's more or less how we kind of got into the conversation of Laurel Canyon. You had given me some articles to go over,
right,
and everything. It was fascinating. So, yeah, jumping back to the Laurel Canyon, I thought it was, personally, I think it's interesting to kind of put what else was going on in the world at that time, that being the beginning of the conflict in Vietnam. Just quickly to give people kind of a high level of what's going on politically in the geopolitical arena, there's the famous Gulf of Tonkin false flag attack that occurred in early August of 1964. Interesting enough, and we'll go back to this, Jim Morrison's father happened to be the admiral of one of the ships that took part in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident. And I think at this point it's pretty clear that it is a false flag incident. I believe
it's been all but admitted, but everyone realizes that the claim that these U.S. warships had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin was an all-out lie, and I think there were actually two events. History records it as, in fact, a false flag now, but maybe not in so many words. But Morrison's father was an admiral. He wasn't just a guy on the scene. He was the guy on the scene. Mm-hmm. So you can go ahead and carry it forward, but I think the name of the ship he was on, was it the Bonhomme Richard?
Yes, I think that's the name of it, yes.
Anyhow, there's historical echoes around that ship's name go back in time. Go ahead, James.
Sure. And then, so basically, again, you have a false flag. That immediately allows Congress to pass what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This ultimately gives President Johnson, for the first time officially, the ability to fund an all-out war against the North Vietnamese without a proper declaration of war from Congress. Beginning in February of 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder commences. That was a series of aerial bombardments of North Korea. And that began in early 65. According officially, of course, most of us probably are aware that there were troops unofficially in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, at the early part of the 1960s. But by March of 1965, the first U.S. soldiers are officially placed in South Vietnam. By the end of 1965, over 200,000 U.S. soldiers are sent to Vietnam. So you can see there's quite a progression there, going from August, the false flag, to the end of 1965. You suddenly have 200,000 kids running around in South Vietnam.
Right, and so just to make it perfectly clear why we're giving the historical kind of wiki entry on what was going on, or what the press claims was going on. For my money, I think that most wars are mostly marketing, and it's hard to tell what actually really goes on. Although I did have relatives in Vietnam, there was clearly something going on there. Tell them what we're correlating the year 1965 to as we move forward.
Sure. So 1965 is key. That's when the beginning of the anti-war movement starts across multiple universities in the United States of America, and quite a concentration of anti-war activity in UC Berkeley in the 1965 period. So now you've got anti-war sentiments in California. It's at that point in time the idea of Laurel Canyon pops up. So we've had the Beatles who broke the United States, I think, February 1964, and suddenly there's an emerging rock and roll community in Los Angeles in a small neighborhood called Laurel Canyon, and that begins late 1964 and leads into 1965. So
Right, and we should state almost all the big names from the 60s, with very few exceptions, are going to come through this Laurel Canyon area. Mm-hmm. And the strange thing that really will grab most people is that there was no music industry on the West Coast to speak of when all these people just for some reason showed up in Laurel Canyon and decided they were going to be rock stars and invent mm-hmm. the hippie movement and invent rock and roll. But what's stranger yet is that many of these people are rich. These supposed early hippies, like Crosby as an example, mm-hmm. his early band is called Jet Set, which kind of reflects what we're talking about here. And he's filthy rich from the get-go, and we'll get a little into his his family tree, which goes all the way back to the founding fathers. Mm-hmm. But just to make it perfectly clear, the music industry is a pretty big deal in New York, in Memphis, and in Nashville. And on the West Coast, there's really not much to speak of yet. Here come all these assets, all the children of military people. So go ahead, James, take it forward.
Yes, definitely. So basically what happens in 1964, the Byrds are created at that point. And the Byrds are ultimately a prototype Monkees style band. It's a band that allegedly was two individuals who had some music talent that were highlighting the folk music scene on Sunset Strip. David Crosby comes along. Officially, he just watched A Hard Day's Night or something of the sort, and suddenly he wants to be in a rock band. So by the end of 1964, this group of 5 musicians, one of which was Chris Hillman. He was a kind of a virtuoso mandolin player, I believe, gets put into this band and is required to play the bass guitar. Had no experience before that. They have a drummer who's considered handsome or cute for the teen girls. Never played drums before. He's placed in this band. So by 1964, they get hooked up with a Bob Dylan song called Mr. Tambourine Man. That's released as a single, end of 64. And then we go into 1965, where on 1965, the summer solstice, the Byrds released their first album, Mr. Tambourine Man. And you had some ideas on the importance of that date.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things that come out of the Byrds there. And the first thing we should mention is that the Byrds, which clearly none of these guys really had any musical talent, so how they were showing up at this place that had no musical industry to form a rock band that was instantly getting signed and making albums. But as he points out, there's 2 songs that come out of the Byrds early on. One is Turn, Turn, Turn. The other one is Tambourine Man. Both of these are kind of timed with solstices and equinoxes. And the funny thing about Turn, Turn, Turn is it was written by Pete Seeger. Now, I know something about Pete Seeger because he lives literally in the neighborhood where I've moved, not in my neighborhood, the next township over, which is a little bit richer, quite a bit richer than where I live. Pete Seeger was out there in a place called Little Compton, and we used to go in the summer times to see him and his grandson perform. But Pete Seeger wrote the song Turn, Turn, Turn. And so much of what we talk about on this podcast relates back to Jewishness and the kind of ruling class. This song is no exception. Pete Seeger writes it. For some reason, it's given to the Byrds. The Byrds get a hit, and its lyrics are drawn from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, which is Latin for, I guess it's supposed to mean gatherer or traditionally teacher or preacher. And it talks about the very things that we were talking about in the release dates, when things are released at the winter solstice or the spring equinox. And in some cases, a song will be released near the solstice in the United States, but held and released like in London near the equinox. And here is this song, Everything Has Its Season, Turn, 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 which is echoing what they're actually doing with the song. And as far as the Tambourine Man goes, I'm going to have to think for a minute. I know you asked me flat out, but I've forgotten exactly what I had researched on that. So I'll get back to that. Go ahead.
Okay. So here we go. We've got this answer to the Beatles, the Byrds, fabricated band already on Life magazine. This group has maybe performed for a couple months, getting national attention. They're being placed into Sunset Strip clubs that have some potential intelligence agency backing, some kind of questionable financing, questionable management, and so forth. Next album that really rolls out of this time period then is the Mamas and the Papas, The album is called "If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears," which you had commented was an interesting title for another made-up band that popped out of nowheres.
Right. I mean, when you start to consider the things that we're going to bring up here, you will begin to look at the names of songs, the names of albums in a whole different way. And as an example of this, keep in mind the band The Pretenders. When we're done with this, you will probably look at the name of that band in a whole other way. And I'm sorry about Tambourine Man. The only thing I can recall right now before we jump forward is that I believe it was written by Bob Dylan.
It was, yes.
In the same year or very near, and for some reason just handed off to this new band that was instantly signed to a record label, and then it was released on the summer solstice. And Tambourine Man being released on the summer solstice is playing on this occult idea of when the sun is at the height of its power. But sorry, I backtracked a little bit there.
No problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
No problem. Well, the interesting guy out of the Mamas and Papas, of course, was that John Phillips, another musician who has strong U.S. Marine Corps military ties. His father was a U.S. Marine Corps captain. As a child, John hopped around in countries such as Haiti, Nicaragua, some other Central American countries. He later was appointed to the Naval Academy at some point in time, but then dropped out. I think in late 50s, he married Susie Adams, who was a direct descendant of John Adams.
So there's the second one. Crosby has a link back to the Founding Fathers, and here's another one. So go ahead.
Exactly. And then I believe he had some family members who were career employees of the Pentagon. Susie's Adams, again, the direct descendant of John Adams, had a father who worked with intelligence operations in Europe, also found at the Pentagon.
His sister Rosie worked at the Pentagon.
Yes, yep. And then there was an interesting part that was mentioned that one of his first jobs, this being John Phillips, he was working on a charter fishing boat wherein his coworkers were 4 retired Army generals. Later, Phillips was located in Havana during Castro's uprising. Then, at some point in time, he found his way out on Sunset Strip. And they basically, I believe what happened was, the story is that they were on a Caribbean island. John Phillips, he had met his future wife, Michelle Phillips, and I believe they were supposed to be in a Caribbean island doing acid, dropping LSD or something, and that's when they wrote this first album. But they more or less disappeared. They were on an island. They popped back into L.A., and then their first album, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, happened.
Which is a funny thing, too, because, I mean, when you begin to look at all this, and we didn't even point out with the Byrds all the military parents that had gone on, some of them in intelligence, every single person, almost to a person that we're going to talk about here, has a military connection through the generation or their parents above them. But what's funny about John Phillips is here's a guy gains an appointment to a naval academy. He's got family members that go back to the Founding Fathers, a sister and relatives that are going to end up working in the Pentagon, and we're told that he dropped out. Well, I would remind people of a movie called, what's that Mel Gibson movie called?
Conspiracy Theory?
Yeah, Conspiracy Theory or something like that, Conspiracy. In that, there's some lines where he's basically stating flat out that the Grateful Dead are agents, operative agents. And so when we look back on the encoding that goes in a movie and we look at John Phillips, we can always wonder, did he drop out of the Naval Academy, or was he actually an operative of some kind assigned to help define the hippie movement and basically drug out a generation? But anyhow, I keep tracking you off. Go ahead.
No, that's interesting. And then, of course, he had the allegations come out against him by his daughter, Mackenzie Phillips, where she claimed that he had been having sexual relations with her since she was an early teenager and so forth. But just another interesting side note into rock and roll hero from the 60s.
Yeah, not only that, he apparently had drug charges or something brought against him at one point that should have put him away for a long, long time, and it just didn't happen. It didn't stick.
Yeah, a lot of these guys seem to have been able to get around the law at this point in time.
Yeah.
Next interesting character, of course, is Frank Zappa. He moved to Laurel Canyon for a brief period in time, and speaking of families belonging to the military-industrial complex, his father was Francis Zappa, who was officially a meteorologist at the Edgewood Arsenal, headquarters of the Army Chemical Center in Maryland. Edgewood is known to be the Army's manufacturing and testing facility of chemical weapons. He grew up on a base. Zappa, at one point in time, met an interesting individual named Herb Cohen. We'll talk about him later, but this is an individual who's got some strong military ties who managed to make his way out to LA in the 50s and began to promote folk bands, promote music venues and so forth. But again, a guy that later on does some strange vacations in the early 60s and so forth. And then he, at that point in time, I don't know if it's in Laurel Canyon or if he moves out there, but he meets Gail Zappa, Adelaide Sloatman. That is the future wife of Frank Zappa. Her father was a nuclear weapons research physicist working with the U.S. Navy. She went to elementary school, of course, with Jim Morrison. She then worked in London at the Office of Naval Research and Development and managed to move back to New York City. And along with another woman, they wanted to be groupies in L.A., so they gave up this career with the intelligence, Navy intelligence, and decided to head out to L.A. and be groupies and so forth. And then she became involved on the Sunset Strip scene as well. So, yeah, any thoughts on Zappa?
Yeah, well, Zappa is like the hub. He's an early hub of everything that goes on at Laurel Canyon. What's funny about Zappa is not only did he discover and bring to the fore some musicians that everyone's familiar with, like Steve Vai. I think he found Steve Vai when he was like 16 or something, but characters like Alice Cooper. But you see, Zappa was kind of a pro-war, anti-hippie guy who was actually busy in Laurel Canyon fabricating from scratch not only what the hippie movement would be, but what it would look like, the clothes they would wear, this kind of thing. And his place in Laurel Canyon, which was called, what was it, the Log Cabin or something like that? Yeah, it's right next to this military-industrial complex place. What's the place called? Do you remember?
It's called Lonesome Mountain Laboratory, I believe.
Lookout.
Lookout Mountain, yes.
Yeah, so Lookout Mountain Lab is right there, and it's even rumored that there may be tunnels between Zappa's place and this other place. And actually, I'll let you break down. So all these future hippies and future rock stars with no musical talent and no music industry to speak of in this area have moved to Laurel Canyon. Zappa's kind of one of the central hubs, and he's living next door to Lookout Mountain Labs. Can you break down what Lookout Mountain Labs was?
Yeah, it's an interesting spot. It was more or less a film studio that was on the top of this Laurel Canyon area. Some of the official knowledge regarding the history of the installation, it was built in 1941 as a World War II air defense center. After 1947, the installation was converted into an Air Force film studio. I believe the official reason for taxpayer money being spent on this installation was the Air Force needed a place to study atomic weapon testing and then the films and the stills that were taken during these atomic bomb tests. The installation included a full stage, 2 screen rooms. It had the ability to process 16 and 35 millimeter motion picture films. Had a animation and editorial department, 17 climate controlled film vaults, helicopter pad, bomb shelters.
How many directors?
No, like some 250.
Yeah, 200. So they retained 250 directors direct from Hollywood, and this place was off the grid pretty much in terms of, it's not like a normal naval base or a normal facility where, there's a sign outside. This was totally undercover, and it had a lot to do with the supposed nukes. And on another episode I may cover, in my view, nukes are a complete hoax. There are no such thing as nuclear weapons, and there is no such thing as nuclear energy either. And for a lot of people, that's going to be hard to hear for the first time, but I may do a show to kind of break down where this was going. And in any ways, this Lookout Laboratory, who's in the heart of the beginning of 60s rock and roll and the hippie movement, is sitting there with 250 directors directly linked up and involved with CIA to Hollywood, and apparently has underground passages to Zappa's place. So anyhow, I don't know how bad I've twisted your road, but go ahead.
No, that's an important part. I think even Jared Leto, I think I read, had recently purchased that. So be curious to see what comes out of that in the coming years. Next guy that's kind of on the hit list here of individuals who had some military ties, Stephen Stills. Stephen Stills was one of the initial musicians that formed Buffalo Springfield. His father was officially an engineer and builder. spent time in Illinois, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Costa Rica, Panama. So again, you can kind of get the sense that there was some consulting done on behalf of certain named agencies. He was enrolled at a military academy in Florida when he was younger, possibly spent some time in Central American Florida as a child. He moved to New York City and then finally moved to Laurel Canyon in 1966. One of the interesting things that is in his official biographies is the fact that he would speak of being in the jungles in Vietnam in the early 1960s. And again, we had mentioned the research. Officially, U.S. troops weren't in Vietnam until 1965, but of course there was some consulting done, some unofficial activity that was possibly happening in that area of the world, early 60s. But typically those claims that Stephen Stills made regarding his involvement in the Vietnam War, they were typically dismissed as drug-induced exaggerations.
But here we have another guy who is going to be a rocker and a hippie and all these things, but here's the second guy who was inducted into the military at a high level, and then the trail kind of goes cold, like he quit or what happened. It's not really clear. Mm-hmm. And again, are we looking at someone who is actually co-opted into, some Delta Force or some CIA type operation where he would mirror the kind of conspiracy ideas that are brought forth in the Mel Gibson movie Conspiracy, where these guys are actually operatives that cross borders with very little trouble because they're rock stars. They go just about anywhere they want. But anyhow, keep pushing.
Yeah, Buffalo Springfield, they had a really interesting history too, a very fast and furious start. There's a story that Neil Young drove from Canada. He had met Stephen Stills at one point as a child or when he was a teenager, drove there. They had this miraculous encounter in the downtown LA area. There was like a U-turn with a car involved. It's a very, very probably fantastic story for most people to believe that's actually how the two managed to meet. But what I thought was interesting, according again to the official biographies, this group was formed on April 6th of 1966. They were suddenly playing their first appearance at Hollywood's prestigious venue, the Troubadour. So again, this band is just brought together, no real experience playing together, but they're suddenly inserted into the public limelight. 4 days later, they then opened for the Byrds' South California tour.
Right.
Then they did a 6-week gig on the Strip at the Whiskey, which the Whiskey has some ties to an individual we'll talk about later, which wrapped up on June 20th, 1966. And then suddenly they were opening on July 25 for the Rolling Stones at the Hollywood Bowl. So for a group who basically didn't play together in April, suddenly open up for the Rolling Stones in July, it's a fairly quick acceleration to fame, I think.
Right. Well, there's no doubt. And not only that, I mean, there's no getting away from that there really is no big music industry in the part of the world they moved to, L.A. at the time. And instantly these guys are getting signed. And in the case of the Byrds, what we see is they're not even writing their own music. They're taking Pete Seeger songs. They're taking Dylan songs to become number one hits. But just to draw a line for people, as we go through this, there's going to be mention of so many of these people who went to school together, knew each other, met in some kind of fortuitous way. But let's use an example here. Most people listening to this probably are not old enough to remember the Kent State shootings, which happened in the Vietnam era. May 4th, of course, 4th being the coded number for death. May 4th, 1970, supposedly, here it is again, 4 people were killed on the Kent State University campus by National Guardsmen. But here's the crazy thing. People will remember that one of the on and off band members of the people we've been talking about here, Neil Young, wrote a song called Ohio. Tin Soldiers and Nixon's Coming, we're finally on our own. You guys remember the song. Well, he wrote it about the supposed shooting by National Guard troops of 4 students at Kent State. But here's the kicker. Neil Young wrote the song. Here's all the people that are famous rockers that were there. Joe Walsh from the Eagles was there. Jerry Casale from Devo was there. But it's funny when you look up the references to this, because in some cases they act like the whole band Devo was at Kent State and saw the shooting. But here's the real killer. Chrissie Hynde from the Pretenders was there, and they have a whole kind of statement from her. Oh, I heard tat-a-tat-tat-tat. It sounded like fireworks, and then we're screaming, effing people were killed. all these famous rockers just happened to be at the Kent State shooting, which I am calling flat out another false flag. And I encourage people to go back and do a Google image search, because you will see that there is a handful of staged imagery that was used to push that. And it was, in Life magazine and all the big ones at the time. But sorry about that, James. I know I twisted your line there, but I just wanted to demonstrate to people that it's beyond possibility, the coincidences that go on here. So go ahead.
Well, that's just it. All the coincidences. I mean, I think at this point in time, it's safe to say that this is the probability of all of these things happening randomly and for the spirit of humanity and the peace and anti-war movement. It doesn't add up.
It's nil. It's non-existent.
Yep. So the next candidate on the Laurel Canyon tour is the big one, Jim Morrison. Of course, he was with the Doors. They released a self-titled Doors, I think, in 1966, 1967. Some of the facts regarding Jim Morrison, as previously mentioned, he was the son to Admiral George Stephen Morrison, who was of the Gulf of Tonkin infamy.
Basically started Vietnam.
He did, yep. He went to a naval kindergarten with Adelaide Sloatman, who was later Frank Zappa's wife, Gail Zappa.
Of course.
He attended a high school in Virginia with John Phillips and Cass Elliot of the Mamas and Papas.
Of course.
And then he, some of the official biographies always have a term reconciling this, but initially he was kind of a clean-cut academic conservative child. He arrived later on the Sunset scene, Laurel Canyon scene, with like complete band, rock star persona, and an impressive collection of songs that he allegedly wrote over a 3-year time period. Again, I think Jim Morrison has actually said in some of his interviews that he was not able to play instruments and really had no musical training, but was somehow able to create this catalog of famous songs that all of us are probably familiar with over a 3-year period.
Right, and I would point out, anytime you see a movie like, I forget the famous director's name who did the movie The Doors, but what they're doing is creating the narrative that they want the public to regurgitate over time. This goes into biographies, it gets spouted out in movies, and it creates this false construct to cover for what these people really were. Anyhow, I don't want to get you off track here with Jim, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, again, it's just an individual who just more or less appears to be an actor. He was placed on the scene, had his big hit album. Of course, he was kind of a bad boy of rock and roll. I mean, I remember in high school, I had friends who had posters of Jim Morrison in their bedrooms and so forth. I mean,
right.
It's just he was a hero to a lot of kids that I grew up with.
Not only that, let me interject here too. Yeah. There is also the story that he was in college in studying for the film industry. That's the claim that is made in these movies and other things. Although when I was researching him, I saw very little on this, but there's one key thing that you had handed me that I think is critical here. As we have stated, Jim Morrison's father was an admiral. He's the guy responsible for the false flag attack that started the Vietnam War. And actually there's 2 events there that are actually recognized on the record now as false flags. But Jim Morrison allegedly died in Paris on July 3rd, 1971. This is the same day his father gave the keynote speech decommissioning the aircraft carrier USS Bonhomme Richard, which was one of the ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin. So there it is again, your kind of occult, date games being played. Anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very curious coincidence, again, to have it on the same day. The next interesting note, this is considered by official biographies of the Laurel Canyon scene and also some of the more alternative research, that the first death blow to the Laurel Canyon scene was considered to be the Monterey Pop Festival of June 16th through the 18th, 1967. This was a John Phillips, Terry Melcher inspired concept that brought many of the Laurel Canyon acts away from small venues and into the massive sports arenas that would later happen in the late 60s and 70s. Lineup featured acts like the Byrds, the Mamas and the Papas, Buffalo Springfield, who we've discussed. Also featured individuals such as Jimi Hendrix and other artists. But it was considered the kind of the epiphany of the Laurel Canyon scene. Again, you had most of these bands playing in these questionably financed clubs, such as the Whiskey A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip. Now there's suddenly a large pop presentation of all these bands, and they're more or less injected into mainstream media and so forth.
And given, round the clock radio time. And actually, this event that you're talking about, almost in a way, really is a kind of a milestone marker for this all gets kicked up to a whole other level at Monterey. And not only that, Janis Joplin was there. I think it's safe to say that the Monterey Festival was completely staged and designed to do what it did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of goes into what we were talking about. There's a couple of ideas of some beta testing happening here in the early 60s in this specific canyon area of LA. I know you had talked about the idea of hippie fashion as well as introduction of drugs. Do you want to kind of talk about that? It's pretty interesting.
Well, sure. Frank Zappa, they described like one of the places he lived, I think it was the log cabin, where the actual look of the inside of this place. And again, we're talking about a guy who's pro-war, has clear military ties, is kind of the godfather to everything that's going on in Laurel Canyon. And you can see what's funny about Zappa is he makes all this music, finds all these famous people, but can anyone name a Frank Zappa song? Unless you're a hardcore music person, you're going to understand that he didn't really create anything in terms of music that changed the scope of America or the world in any way. Having said that, the inside of his house was like a prototype for what the hippie movement was going to be. Even in his early music, you can hear him referring to the kind of hippies being thought of as dirty, long hair, unwashed, scantily clad. And I've forgotten, James, there's also a relationship there with either a girlfriend or a wife who has a clothes place on the Strip that is actually the earliest known prototype of what hippie clothing will look like.
Sure. That leads into the whole Vito, Palakas, and the Freaks. Very interesting portion of Laurel Canyon history. This is a individual who is kind of a precursor to Charles Manson. He had a lot of the same similarities. He was kind of a charismatic individual, an individual who probably didn't indulge in drugs, but had all of his followers and his group of followers indulgent. He was always in control and so forth. He had moved into the LA area in the late 50s and 60s, kind of had a spotty background as well. The interesting thing about him is that his wife opened a hippie clothing store ahead of the time, and those were the very vibrant, scantily
before
clad.
hippies existed.
Exactly. And it appears as though it rolled out in this fashion. So he's got a wife who's got the clothing store. They're very charismatic leaders. They bring in some youths that are probably lost or kind of feeling alone in the world or whatnot, embracing them with sort of a father figure. He creates this group called the Freaks. The Freaks are known to be a huge hit on the Sunset Strip. So there's this idea that when these bands such as the Byrds, Jim Morrison, Buffalo Springfield, when they're on various stages on Sunset Strip, a lot of the people aren't necessarily going to watch these bands. They're going to watch Vito and the Freaks. And so you've got this group of people who are women who are scantily dressed, very bright colors, doing these outrageous dance moves on the dance floor, while the David Crosbys, the John Phillips, and so forth are in the background singing. So you've got this idea of this hippie culture that's more or less being tested in
prototypes, right? Beta tested, and not only that, this guy, how do you say his name again? Vitatis.
Yeah, it's I don't know how you pronounce his proper name, but it's Vito Palakas. That's his name that he's referred to in a lot of the magazines and books and so forth.
So this guy moves to L.A. after serving in the military, of course. He was a merchant marine.
He was, yes. Yep,
and
merchant marine.
It's not easy to kind of uncover what he did or what his rank was either.
Right. It's interesting because when you listen to some of David McGowan's work, again, this is the author, when he first researched this, he said it on numerous interviews that he had a hard time finding any history on this Vito and the Freaks character. But once the book that he had published and some of the PDFs and articles that he was posting to his website, suddenly there was like Wikipedia pages being created and so forth.
Right.
So,
of all the people, he seems like the total just kind of double agent guy where even people who should be at these clubs to hear the Byrds or other bands are actually showing up to hear him, but no one's ever heard of the Freaks or any of the music they made. They were there prototyping and beta testing what the hippie movement would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even in the official document of Laurel Canyon, it's another book that was written, I think in 2008, and I forget the author's name, Hillman or something like that, but that's there's mention that Vito and the Freaks were in Iowa, which really isn't too far away from where I'm at. So you can imagine corn country 1965, small stadiums, small stages, and so forth. You have the Birds, and then you have Vito and the Freaks. So this band is performing across Midwest United States. They're rolling out the hippie idea, the hippie dance, the hippie clothing, and so forth. I mean, somebody had to finance this stuff. I mean, it's not like these people just magically receive cash.
Of course, and this is also kind of where we draw the line to the whole psychedelic movement, right? This is where LSD is kind of injected into this culture that's being developed.
Yeah. It's when I was going through the anti-war structure, it was interesting that as things started to get more or less serious in mid-1965, early 1965 in Berkeley, I think it was, let me find the date here, October 15th, 1965, there were 4 large anti-Vietnam protests occur in 4 separate cities. At this point in time, there's a large protest march occurring in Oakland with some 15,000 protesters. And suddenly now we introduce Ken Casey's Merry Pranksters, make a possible appearance in the anti-war movement. Of course, Ken Casey is the famous LSD proponent who was distributing freely, driving across the country, him and his Merry Pranksters basically advertising the use of LSD as a form of conscious control.
Right, and it should be stated that this is the period of time, and it's kind of a broad thing, where the military and the CIA and other places like this were experimenting with LSD. They actually were openly funded at some points to do these experiments. But the thing about LSD is this. You know, if you look back to the 50s and you say, well, why weren't all the drugs here? Well, there was some pot here and there, but you see, you can get a seed and grow pot. LSD is not like that. You cannot get your hands on LSD unless you have a chemist in a lab somewhere that's going to produce it. And what we see is that the LSD that drugged out so much of this generation, who would have opposed, for the most part, the Vietnam War and other things about what the political leadership in this country was doing, this drug came directly out of places like Berkeley and what's the other guy, the poster boy for LSD?
Timothy Leary.
Yeah, Timothy Leary. So here's another college professor who's basically telling the whole generation, because he's a voice now and he's famous, to what was it? Tune in, turn off, drop out, tune in, and turn on, or something like that. Basically telling kids to drop out of school and start to do drugs. My point is this. There is a reason why 65 forward the drugs hit so heavily into this counterculture lifestyle that was being developed by the military-industrial complex and the CIA. It's because they created the drugs and put them into that community to have an effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the key figures in all of this is mentioned in the book is too. His name is Augustus Owsley Stanley III, another interesting character in the whole 1960s counterculture scene. He was the son to Stanley II, a military officer during World War II, and he was later a government attorney in Washington, D.C. His grandfather was a U.S. House of Representative, a governor of Kentucky, and so forth. Mother, he was a niece, or she was a niece of William Owsley, the governor of Kentucky. This is an individual who kind of got wrapped up and was placed into military academies while younger. And then the official story is that he rebelled and dropped out of these schools and so forth. But there's missing periods of time. He attended the University of Virginia. Then he enlisted in the United States Air Force. He works as an electronics specialist with radio intelligence and radar. At some point in time, he moved to L.A., just happened to move out there, and he was employed by JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And the thing that I thought was really interesting, so again, you got a guy that's kind of got quite a bit of background in electronics and so forth. He moves to Berkeley in 1963, and officially he tries LSD for the first time. Now, this isn't a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal obit that I had found online. And this obit goes on to claim that because he enjoyed this LSD so much, he spent 3 weeks in the university's library poring over chemistry journals. So this individual is able to spend 3 weeks basically cramming all this chemistry and figured out how to mass produce LSD at that point in time. In 1965, he met Ken Kesey, who we just previously discussed, and through Kesey, he meets the Grateful Dead. So now you've got this individual, again, with ties to JPL, the military. He's acting as the Grateful Dead's financer, sound engineer, and providing thousands and actually millions of tabs of free LSD to all of these kids in California at this point in time. It even mentions that this individual, I think, produced 4 million hits, and he gave most of it away freely. So,
holy smokes!
So you got to wonder again, if you're into making money, I guess officially the idea is that he wanted to increase consciousness of his generation, but somebody had to provide the chemicals and so forth and the means to make that many volumes of drugs. And then he was also instrumental to the lead up into the events that was the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, which again threw the hippie lifestyle into kind of mass media attention. An interesting character. And again, it's a guy who's actually more involved with the Grateful Dead and that whole scene. I think I even read at one point in time he and the Grateful Dead had done some preliminary acts or something like that in Watts prior to the Watts riots.
Right. And that's where they had LSD was being tested in that community when the Watts riots happened. So it was all totally hooked together. And it gets crazier for people who kind of do research about how screwed up the ruling class is. There's even Rothschilds involved as producers around this music. I think one of the guys was Paul Rothschild. I know he had to do with Janis Joplin, but another point of interest from the Monterey Pop Festival, which was clearly designed to rocket all these counterculture rock stars up to the next level, is two of them died in the 27 Club, right? Jimi Hendrix was there, and I think Janis Joplin was 27. Was she one of those 27 Club people? I don't remember.
I don't recall either.
Yeah, but they both have these kind of hoax, occult, weird deaths like Prince and Bowie did. But to cap it off a little more, there are certain members of this community, like Crosby is a good example. Crosby is a special person because of his bloodline, among other things. Mm-hmm. And he comes from a very wealthy family. It is very difficult to nail down exactly what that bloodline is, but it's pretty clear that his bloodline probably goes back to the founding fathers. But to put a fine point on this, as I was reading through accounts of all these women always wanting to get pregnant by Crosby, I kind of laughed because the guy is a troll. Mm-hmm. His personality is nothing special, and he's kind of a fat, bald, drugged-out-looking character. It's not like he's going to be a female magnet. But as I read this, I remembered Melissa Etheridge, who is supposed to be gay and be married to a woman. Did you know that Melissa Etheridge sought out Crosby to be the biologic father of her 2 children?
No, I don't remember that.
Yeah, I forget the names of the kids, but that kind of underscores what we're talking about in this very bizarre community of people. Here's this guy who's nothing special to look at. He's kind of repulsive in a way. He's got that walrus mustache. He's always overweight, and all these women want to have his babies. Mm-hmm. And that gives more credence to the fact that there is a perceived specialness to that man's genes, although to look at him you wouldn't know it. But anyhow, I think I yanked us way off the path. Where were we?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. He's another individual, again, as you mentioned, with a military background, but I found it interesting that his father was a military educated individual, but he got involved with the New York Stock Exchange after school. And
was that the guy who did all this when he was like 16?
Actually, that's another individual. That's one of the financiers of the Byrds Early Act. We can get to him here.
Yeah, you got to talk about this guy because it's literally unbelievable to consider that, a 15, 16-year-old kid's doing it. But anyhow, I'll let you go down the path. I don't want to shoo you in the wrong direction.
No problem. But he actually ended up, this again being David Crosby's father, he was involved in Hollywood too. I imagine he would have been involved with this laboratory on the top of Laurel Canyon. He did some interesting documentary work in Brazil, Honduras, Brazil. Again, these are all very crucial countries during the Cold War of the 50s and so forth. But at the end of the day, he worked for Roger Corman, which is kind of an interesting guy. I know a little bit about him, but he's famous for his B horror films in the 50s. And so you've got this trained military individual who specializes in photography and so forth, and he's doing these B horror films. So I be curious down the road to do some research on some of those movies and see what types of themes are being presented and so forth.
Corman's kind of funny because he's so famous and most of the work he has done has been cheesy B movies, but he was really known for putting big-breasted women without their shirts on in his movies for a lot of it. And it's kind of funny when you consider these rich people like Crosby's father, who was a military intelligence operative and working in cinematography, having anything to do with these kind of low-budget B-roll films that Corman was known for.
Yeah, the other individual that you were talking about with the Wall Street tie, that was Naomi Hirshhorn. And again, to official biographies and so forth, she placed a $5,000 investment for a 5% share in the Byrds. So basically, again, going back to the idea of the Byrds being a fabricated band, there's no real musical experience between the 5 actors / musicians. They needed equipment, they needed guitars, bass guitars, drum sets, and so forth. So this Naomi at that point in time put $5,000 into it. I did some research on her, and fantastic story again. Her father was Joseph Hirshhorn, an individual who apparently at age 15 managed a job on Wall Street. By age 16, he had launched his career as a stockbroker financier, which is, I don't know, I can't even imagine that today.
No, I guess it's safe to say Hirshhorn must be a Jewish name, right?
That I don't know. I didn't look into the background on that, but apparently when he started at 16, by his age 18, he had acquired enough money that he basically acquired these 2 rare etchings and began his career as a collector of mass quantities of art. And then in 1966, he basically passed off this collection of art to become part of the Smithsonian. So just a kind of an interesting side character in all of this.
Well, what's weird is the 2 etchings he acquires at age 18 are Dürer, and anyone who knows anything about alchemy and occult will know that the Dürer etchings are a big deal in their kind of occult encoded. I don't even know how to describe it. They're just all the things he did were encoded heavily with the very things that drive the community that we're talking about here and the secret societies. So he did that at age 18.
Yeah, that's quite the story, quite the success story, no doubt.
All right, man. So where do we go? It's so hard to, sitting here trying to communicate this out to a bunch of people who may have heard of very little of it. It's so difficult because there's so much that you have to get your arms around. So, I mean, where do we go forward from here?
Just 2 other individuals who I thought were interesting in the background of Laurel Canyon. One being Herb Cohen. This was the future business manager of Frank Zappa. So official biographies again, former U.S. Marine who moved to L.A. in 1954 to begin promoting folk music groups. In 1956 or 1959, this individual suddenly began to open up clubs on the Sunset Strip in L.A. And this is the part that I thought was funny. In 1959, he took a break from L.A. and he vacationed in these countries: Cuba, Egypt, Algiers, Europe, the Middle East. He was even in official biographies, there's talk that he was running guns a bit for, I guess they would be candidates for anti-CIA sentiment, but again, who knows what's actually going on there. Then he returned to LA in 1963, and he gave Zappa access to the clubs, to Vito and the Freaks, and all of the benefits of playing on the Strip.
So what's funny about this whole thing to me is, you think about this person who loaned the Byrds $5,000 for a 5% share in the profits. Well, if you did that with any other people, you'd basically be giving $5,000 away for nothing, because there should have been no indication that the Byrds were ever going to be worth anything except the fact that they were being set up to be successful. So this Herb Cohen guy comes and sets these clubs up on the Strip. It's the ultimate insider information, because they're going to need these clubs to get the music out. There's no real music industry around rock music at the time that this is going on. So these people have the ultimate insider's information. Go set up a club here and you'll be filthy, filthy rich by the time, the 70s and 80s roll by, in the same way that the people who financed the Byrds. Anyone who financed a band anywhere knows that there's a 98% chance the band will never be worth anything. Yet this person happened to know that these musical not geniuses were worth investing in and made a fortune, presumably on a 5% share.
Yes. And then the second individual who's interesting to mention, Elmer Valentine. He was a former Chicago vice cop who was indicted for extortion. It's alleged that he had some mafia ties in Chicago gangs and so forth, but he managed to avoid prosecution and conviction, moved to L.A. in January of 1964, and happened to open up the doors to the Whiskey A Go-Go nightclub, which again is prominent in all of these bands' successes and so forth. Interesting to note, within a month of the club's opening, Life magazine had written about it. Jack Parr, a famous 60s commentary, had broadcast from the club. And then celebrities such as Steve McQueen and Jane Mansfield were often spotted visiting the Whiskey A Go-Go, of course, bringing in tourists and so forth. So
Right. So, I mean, how are you ever going to fail when you have that kind of media at your disposal? So Life magazine, for those of you who are not old enough to remember, was a big damn deal. It was probably one of the premier magazines on this world. And so within a month of him opening up the Whiskey A Go-Go, which is going to be such a iconic name through all of rock and roll history moving forward, he gets the insider information to open this. Life magazine writes about it, and all of a sudden you've got Jack Parr, Steve McQueen, James Mansfield, all going to your club. There's no possible way these endeavors can fail at that level.
Yeah, interesting too with Life. I think that was a magazine that actually proved that Paul is still with us. I think that magazine was the piece that, when all those theories were that Paul had died, Paul McCartney, again from the Beatles, late 60s, I think Life magazine was the first that had a exclusive interview to show that, yes, he is still with us.
Right, and I think they're actually showing the fake Paul in Ireland or somewhere on the cover. I've forgotten. I'd have to go back and look. But it goes to show you just how ultra-controlled information is. So here's this American magazine lying to the world, telling everyone that the Paul you see now is the Paul we always had. I'd love to be a fly on the wall when that phone call happens.
I know.
Who calls Life magazine and says, we need some help, run this. Just how does that work? Crazy, just crazy. Mm-hmm. And Jack Parr, I mean, do you know anything about Jack Parr?
I don't. I think I've seen clips on television and so forth with some acts, but I don't know a lot about him.
I'd go into him, but we've got so many people that we're going to be spinning heads by the time we get through this. But, I mean, there's no getting away from all this is so far beyond coincidence that from my personal observation point of having gone through all this, there is no one that is cited in history around the events we're talking about that were not part of the kind of psychological operation that we call rock and roll, that we call the hippie movement, Woodstock, all of it. It's a crazy thing is we all look at Woodstock and we remember it in the way we're supposed to. We remember the movie that just happened to be shot. We remember the music, the bands, the history that we've been handed. But I started to think about Max Yasgur, the guy who supposedly rented the fields to where Woodstock was going to happen. And as I got to looking at him, it became very apparent that there's a reason why Max Yasgur was covered in Rolling Stone when he died. Here's this dairy farmer who's all through rock and roll history just because he rented this space. And the story of that is funny, because at first it was like $50 was going to happen for each day or something. But the truth is he got $75,000 for letting people basically trash 3 fields or something for 3 days or 4 days. But here's the kicker. If you look into Max Yasgur's background, first of all, he's Jewish immigrant. And there's never more than a stone's throw away from any of this from Jewishness. The Jewishness is always at the top of all of this. But he went to New York University and studied real estate law. And at the time of Woodstock, his son Sam was the assistant district attorney in Manhattan. And between the two of them, finagled this whole kind of festival that had never been done before to happen. And it required a district attorney, and it required someone who understood real estate law. So even the very dairy farmer who you think was just happened to be there was clearly a set piece, serving his part in this massive play we call history. All right, welcome back to the second hour of Crow 777 Radio Podcast. I know that this is so much information that we're throwing at everybody, but it's critical to understand what it all means. And without anything further here, I'm going to kick it right back over to you, James, to keep the ball rolling.
Okay. We had mentioned earlier that the Laurel Canyon seemed to have two ends to it. There was the initial pop festival, which basically took the acts out of the Sunset Strip music scene and placed them into a larger limelight, again, with, as you'd mentioned, radio, financing, and so forth. The second part of all of this Laurel Canyon business really happens in 1968 with the introduction of Charles Manson. The document that I read states that Manson came to the canyon in search of Vito Palakis, again, Vito of Vito and the Freaks fame. Vito had apparently left the scene, and I think he had gone to the Caribbean islands. I could be mistaken on that, but he'd left the country at this point in time. So Manson more or less became the new Vito of the canyon. He was very charismatic. He tended to attract young girls, young men that seemed to be kind of lost, looking for a father figure and so forth. Everybody kind of knows who Charles Manson is, but when he got to the canyon, he spent some time with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. His music style impressed individuals such as Neil Young and Mama Cass. He actually recorded a number of songs in Dennis Wilson's studio. The idea of Charles Manson and the actual death of Sharon Tate was that he was starting Helter Skelter, and this is per Vincent Buglioso's book, Helter Skelter, that he had planned a murder spree that would spark an apocalyptic race war, wherein the eventual outcome would be a group of people who could take control of the world by allowing the others to more or less not be able to govern themselves.
And so people understand Helter Skelter, of course, is directly related to a Beatles album.
It is.
And the song Helter Skelter. So there is no separating what we're about to talk about here, Manson. And I will preface everything we're going to say about Manson by stating categorically, there is no living human being named Charles Manson. There is no person sitting in a jail anywhere named Charles Manson. He is an actor. He is a stage set. He is a stage piece. And everything we're going to talk about here, nobody died, nobody got hurt. It was completely staged, for lack of a better word, false flag. And I have done extensive research all the way back into the late 80s and 90s on Helter Skelter, the book, and everything surrounding this. So keep going forward, James.